my side tonight, 'cause I'm the only one who'll stay and help you fight. And I love how your mind works, forgive me.
Hello there, I'm Ben, and this is the first video of my Mix Rundown series for the band KONSOLE. I'll be going over 4 tracks, which will be spread over the 4 different videos. This is the first track, which is the KONSOLE song Take My Side. And in this video I'm going to be going a little bit into kind of my techniques for mixing and how I approached it and various things like that. So I've got the session open here. The first thing I considered when entering the studio with the guys was they sent me one of their rough demos, and the thing that stood out for me most was probably the drum kit. I mean, it's a very rhythmically led song. I mean, there's a bit you can hear in the bridge. It transitions from a kind of just standard crotchet feel to a quarter note feel. So the most important thing for me straight away was to make sure the drums were almost like the main focus of the mix. So a lot of that was done by kind of tracking. I tend to mix mainly off the shell tracks, and then blend in some of the overheads and the room mic for stereo width of the overheads, almost more like spot mics for the cymbals. So yeah, if we solo my drum tracks here, which I've got grouped. Where are you? They are. I'm a big fan of the sound of sampled drums, but I'm not too keen on the act of kind of sampling drums. I think it's a little bit of a cop-out. One thing I was definitely trying to go for was to have the kind of consistent sampled sound without having to resort to just chucking a sample in. I did this through a lot of kind of snare, a lot of kind of gating, heavy gating, and 2 types of compression. I used a compressor generally to level tracks out. So with quite if you use the FabFilter Pro Q, it actually has a hold feature, so you can hold it for the duration of the snare and get some light compression to just even out the entirety of the hit. I then use another compressor for more kind of transient shaper. Go for about kind of 25 milliseconds of attack. If we solo the snare mic here, you can hear. Using the Wave C1 compressor for this. That allows the initial stick hit through, which kind of makes it sound like the drum is being hit a lot harder than it actually is. In terms of mixing drums as well, I tend to parallel compress quite heavy on especially on the shells and the room. I tend to try and get some of the snap out of the shells using the technique I showed you, and then bring out the body using the parallel compression bus. So if we just whiz it onto a bit in the middle, I can show you what I mean. Pop in the parallel compression bus in and out. Especially with the kick drum, it feels like a lot of the kind of dead space in the middle. Another trick actually, which I borrowed from a lot of 80s mixes. I mean, this band is quite heavily inspired by kind of 80s tracks. Was to the use of gated snare reverb. This isn't used in the kind of traditional sense to put the track in a room. It's used to kind of elongate the snare, make it a much longer sustain. So if you can see what I mean, I've got the snare going to its own gated reverb bus. It's only very subtle, but it adds a lot more sustain to the drums. General approach to mixing, I've just recently adopted a top-down mixing technique. I find when I send tracks off to mastering, I wasn't a big fan of the way it came back because I wasn't used to hearing it with the kind of heavy compression and EQ and stuff. So I tend to put a rough kind of ballpark mastering compressor, an EQ and a limiter just on the master bus, just to it kind of helps with the mixing, getting everything sort of sounding as if it were mastered, so that there's no kind of hopefully no nasty surprises. So the main focus of the mix was the drums. Also, so again, the next kind of main thing was to ensure the bass drum, the bass track set right with the kick. Again, because it's I went for quite a modern production, so the bass I tend to quite heavily compress the bass, more so in the low end. I mean, I'm using the FabFilter multiband compressor here, so you can see the low end is pretty heavily compressed at the ratio of sort of 3.8 to 1. There's a lot of compression going on here, and a lot of compression as well in the low mids. I found it was quite muddy. And then, oh, that's actually quite an extreme EQ. But I guess it sounded good. I mean, we've got this kind of multi-frequencies as well as the low-end frequencies. In terms of the rest of the mix, I tried to be fairly minimal in what I actually applied. And you can see I've got a group for all the guitars, which were actually quad-tracked through a Marshall amp and just an SM57 microphone. And again, just got standard, pretty standard high end and low end roll off with a tiny bit of FabFilter compression just to make it sit a bit nicer. An interesting technique I actually picked up the vocals. The band are very interested in doing things I don't know, very manually, shall we say. I found myself reaching for a lot of heavy, harsh EQ for this section in the bridge here.
And I tried to believe you, but there's no truth. All there is shame.
I tried a bunch of different telephone EQs and distortions and couldn't quite get the sound out of it that I liked. I did, however, have access to a copper microphone at this point, which is a pretty dirty sounding microphone. But I actually decided to take a gamble and begin to sort of re-mic the vocal track by placing the copper microphone through my monitor and just soloing the track. I ended up using the take. I mean, if you look at the actual mix window, I've literally got an EQ on it, or a compressor rather. I haven't even touched it with EQ, just using the natural mic sound.
And I tried to believe you, but there's no truth. All there is shame.
I found out that I found, especially in this middle section, that the snare drum wasn't cutting through enough, and as I kind of outlined, especially the triplet relationship between the kick and snare was kind of one of the main driving features of the song. I used a technique actually that I learned from engineer Adam Nolly Getgood, who does a lot of work with who is the bassist and producer for the band Periphery. And he suggested a compressor actually on the master bus, sidechain input to the snare. That's so it's ducking the entire bus by about 1 to 2 dB every time the snare hits, which is quite an extreme technique. But if you can hear it, really opens the mix up. I'll take it off and then put it back on, and you'll hear the snare sort of pop out at you a lot more without actually having to have it too loud in the mix. As you can see, we're only really kissing it with the compression, but it seems to kind of gel the track really nicely and kind of ensure the snare has enough pop to it without having to turn the snare up too loud and drowning everything out of the mix. One thing I did find, which was partly down to mic placement, was that especially in this middle section I was getting a lot of bleed from the crash cymbal of all things in the snare mic, which isn't a problem for the verses, where it's kind of mainly playing off the high. But when I with my gate settings, when I got to this middle bit, I get this horrible cymbal wash through every time the snare drum hit, which was really distracting. So it was just a case of really automating the gate to come off during this middle bit. So yeah, aside from that, I tried to be quite minimal when I was mixing this stuff. They're quite as I said, DIY hardware band, so it was a lot about input tones, getting it right. I also have a bit of a tendency to overmix my tracks as well, which I'm trying to get out of the habit of. So yeah, I limit myself to a set amount of time and nothing too heavy with a processing front, and I'm really happy with the way it sounds out, especially the drums. I think that's about it for this video then. I don't think anything else more interesting that I've done. It's all pretty simple. The guitars sound a bit thin at the start deliberately as an almost fake out. We have quite a wide panned just stereo pair of guitars which are a fake out to the when the massive wall of quad track guitars come in. It's quite a nice contrast, I feel.
With your shoes, if only I had the balls to tell you my own. Good night, London. Good night, London. Take. I love how your mind works. Forgive me, but I'm.
Yeah, that's about it for this video, I think. Stay tuned for the next one, where I'll be going over the my other mix for the console track, Give 'Em Something.